Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and joined by my co-host
Andrew. Bills, how are you today?
Andrew,
podcast.
Good to be back and looking forward to this one because I think it's really timely, but all good from my end, mate. What about you?
Everything's going well. Good. Not too sleep deprived, which is good now that there's another little one in the house. So doing well.
Well, now our listeners and our viewers can actually see that the bags under the eyes aren't too bad actually. So I must say it's yeah, your turn will come. Don't worry about it. Once the teething starts coming through, for sure. Andrew, let's get straight into it. What are we talking to our audience today?
Audience, not just listeners.
You picked up on that one.
Yep. So today, look, it's definitely something that's quite topical. So what we're talking about today is really developing a solid cash flow management and budgeting strategy. And the reason that it's really so topical at the moment is interest rates rising, so obviously mortgage pressure, as well as inflation, so cost of living is also increasing. So making sure that you've got a good handle on your cash flow, on your budget, and the amount of money that comes into the household. Sorry, the amount of money that exits the household is not more than the amount of money that comes into the household, is absolutely key. We talk about it all the time. It's the gateway to be able to do anything from a wealth creation perspective. If you don't have a good handle on your budget, then absolutely, no financial plan is ultimately going to work out. It's not going to be sustainable in the long term, and so making sure that you've got a good cash flow management and budgeting strategies, really it's imperative.
It's the old cliche around it's not how much you earn, it's how much you keep.
Yeah.
And we've heard that time and time again, and fundamentally it is the cornerstone of wealth creation. If you're earning $1 million and I'm earning $50,000, but you spend everything that you earn and I manage to save $5,000 a year, I'm actually better off than you are in this instance. So getting that right, and that's even more critical in today's environment too, because we're obviously talking about increasing interest rates in an inflationary environment. So it seems like the cost of absolutely everything is going up. So we thought it'd be a really fitting time to be able to double back onto this particular topic. And I think there's going to be some nuggets of gold. I absolutely love this stuff because it is the foundation of everything that we do, and getting this right is absolutely imperative. And I'd like to say, being the eternal optimist that I am, it's actually easier, I think, than what people think. Once you get this right, it really sets the foundation for everything moving forward.
Yeah, and you consider, the amount of, or what we're going to talk about today is probably a couple of hours worth of work, maybe, from start to finish in terms of setting everything up, in terms of, really running through it and going through the details. You could run through it in, a fairly short amount of time. But in terms of ongoing management, we were talking about it before, and I reckon it maybe takes longer to, get your app up than it actually does to review your cash flow strategy and make sure that it's still working. So it's a little bit of investment at the start for a whole heap of benefit in the future, and the amount of work involved versus what you get out of it at the end of the day is just, it's off the charts.
Definitely worth experiencing the little bit of pain associated with it for what you get out of the back of it. And speaking of pain, I guess the first step, which everybody loves to hate, is creating a budget.
Yes. Absolutely. There's no shortage of tools out there. There's apps, there's the Money Smart website, there's, a whole heap of tools. You can do it on a piece of paper, although I'd probably, try and do it on something electronic if you can, just because it gives you the ability to edit it at ease and have some form of formulas, so that if things do change in the future, you can do it easily as opposed to starting from scratch. But whatever works for you, whatever manner is, going to be easier and less of a barrier to entry for yourself is kind of the key. But getting a budget and a realistic budget is the foundation and starting point of really any financial plan.
Yeah, so just on that, the realistic budget is actually what's happening and happened in reality, as opposed to an aspirational budget that says this is what I think should happen and this is what I want to spend on that. Well, so the idea is to get it right in the first place, and even if it does look, if it's not as pretty as what you'd like or hope or expect, that's actually good because you know where to focus your time and attention. Whereas if you do an aspirational budget and it's not reflective of reality, it becomes a lot more difficult in practical sense. In a practical sense, when it, you know, you are delivering on that you're looking at your numbers going, hang on, how come on paper it works out, but in reality it doesn't? So yeah, have to be realistic. Even if it is ugly, you need to know, because that's your starting point.
Yeah, and there should be, I mean, there's two stages when the next stage is starting to examine your expenses, starting to look at, overspending and all of that stuff forms a part of all of this, which we'll touch on in a little bit. But you can't diagnose the issue without, really looking at things realistically. If your starting point is aspirational, then you're not getting a really solid understanding of where things are at and where you're starting from. The way that I like to, use it is as a bit of a motivator. So it's kind of like, if you're trying to lose a little bit of weight, well, you don't want to weigh yourself when you're at your lowest. You want to weigh yourself when you're at the highest. So the next time that you go to weigh yourself, you've got a bigger difference.
There's a bit of improvement.
Exactly. So, maybe you actually make it worse off as opposed to better off. But no, in all honesty, making sure that you got a really realistic understanding of what your spending has been is the foundational starting point.
Yep. So get that tucked away. That obviously makes sense, starting point. And then we pivot into the bucketing strategy. We've spoken about this time and time again, but the idea behind it is that you want to silo out, in particular, your money and give each bucket a different job, and you don't want to cross-contaminate your buckets. So the real obvious one for me, at least at the start, is to capture all of your income in one bucket. So usually that could be like a cash management account, it could be a transactional account, it could be an online savings account, but essentially all forms of income that you have go into that one bucket.
Yep, absolutely. So money goes into one bucket or one bank account, let's say, whatever it is.
We call them buckets though, but in reality they're all bank accounts. Yeah,
exactly. We're not, look, you can go down to the granular level and you can start looking at, interest rates and what's going to provide the best from an interest rate perspective. But for us, the real foundation and key of this is making sure that your cash flow is set up correctly. But if you wanted to go down the extent of revisiting your savings rate and how much you're getting from an interest perspective, then by all means. But the key is just having one bank account where all of your income flows into.
Yep. And for mortgage holders, that usually tends to be, if you've got the facility available, it tends to be an offset account.
Yeah, yep. Correct. And then off the back of that, so money all goes into the one bucket. What happens from there?
Well, then we start to build the strategy in terms of what buckets or other bank accounts that we have. And I'll use something that's really simplistic just to get the point across. But out of your budget, so there is a correlation now between your budget and the bank accounts that you set up and the amount of money that goes into each bucket or bank account, depending on what its purpose is.
Yep.
So as an example, before we get into the fixed expenses and the point of sales and things like that, let's just assume that your budget looks, it's in the positive and it's reflective of reality, and you turn around and with your budget you say, I want to spend $5,000 a year on holidays. So, and I get paid weekly, as an example. What you'll do is you'll have a bucket that's dedicated to holidays, and your income goes into the main bucket, and every week you will transfer $100, which over a year is $5,000 to meet your budget. You will transfer $100 each week into that bucket, and that will be the money that you spend on holidays. So using that example, the idea is identifying what buckets you need based on your budget, and then organising a direct debit going into each of those buckets for each of the respective purposes, which we'll get into in a sec. But the idea is that you can see and feel it and say, okay, this is the money that I have designated in this example for travel or holidays. That's all I'm going to spend.
Yep.
You don't cross-contaminate and go to another bucket and say, hey, I'm going to, I spent, rather than spending $5,000, I've spent 6 or 7, I'm going to go and take $2,000 from the other bucket, or I'm going to put $2,000 on the credit card and kick the can down the road. The idea is that you're siloing it out so you don't overspend.
Exactly right. Which kind of brings us to, I guess, the two key buckets that should form part of every single strategy. Just because they're expenses that everybody has. I still yet to meet anyone that doesn't have these expenses, but there's one which is a direct debit expense account, what we like to call it, which is, this is all of your expenses that just come out via a direct debit. So you're talking about, your subscription services, you're talking about, depending on how it's done, but your gas and electricity, all of the expenses that you essentially not necessarily can't avoid, but all of the expenses that just get done via direct debit all go into the one bucket and get direct debited out from that bucket. The other account, which is going to account for the other main expenses that you have, is all of your point of sale expenses. So this is the expenses that, I was going to say cash, but most people don't use cash these days. Let's say you're using your debit card. Anything that you're going to use your debit card or your credit card for is all going to come out of the point of sale expenses. So you go to the grocery store, well, you can't direct debit that out. So you're going to have to pull the money out from your direct debit, your point of sale expenses. Your petrol, your going to a restaurant, your whatever it is that's, I've cross-contaminated, but all of your expenses that you need to make from a point of sale perspective are going to come out from a separate bank account or bucket.
Just going back to the direct debit expenses, so the way that I tend to view it as well is that it's point of, just because it's easier, I think, in your mind when you think about it, but point of sale is pretty straightforward. It's you go there and you complete the transaction and payment for that. In that, I'm doing this because it's you're tapping as you're going. So that's pretty straightforward because everybody can get a really clear understanding in terms of what those expenses are. All the other stuff in my mind is non-point of sale. So it can be direct debit if you've got set that up. Yeah. Something as simple as your Netflix, is like that. It comes out of an account. There's no other way to pay for it. The other way is, from a non-point of sale, is also things like your snail mail. And what I mean by that is you may have an expense with your electricity company or your gas company. They're going to email, or hopefully it's email, but they're going to email and post you out a bill, and you've got, 3 weeks to pay it. That there also comes out of this direct debit non-point of sale account that you've got. And those expenses that you incur, when you tie it back into your budget, it should be easy enough to be able to identify and forecast what they are just based on historical numbers that you've got in there. So snail mail or point of sale versus non-point of sale, that's kind of the way that I differentiate the two. And just going back to the point of sale one, the idea and the concept behind this is once you've expunged that money in that account, you can't spend any more. That's the key. So what we tend to talk to people about is the way that we find that this works the most effective is that you have 7 days worth of spending in that particular account. So if you do run out of money at the 5 or the 6 day mark, you're not having to wait like traditionally, someone might get paid monthly where they've run out of money at the 2 week mark and they have to sort of stretch it out for 2 weeks. We try and compress that down to a shorter period. And as you continue, the discipline gets better and you can time those better and better.
Yeah, and what should happen is you should have a float in every single account. So you think about, your direct debit expenses. If you get a gas and electricity bill for, $1,000, if that happens on day one of starting this, and you haven't had the full 12 months to build up the savings, well, you're not going to have enough money in order to be able to pay that bill. So what you should have is a float across each of those accounts. Sorry, I say float, but an amount of savings that just sits in that account that it never dips below, in order to be able to take account or to account for all of the expenses that larger in nature and happen in the earlier part of establishing this strategy. Over the course of the long term, it's fine, it'll all even out, but you need to have enough of a buffer in there so that any of the larger expenses that happen early can be accounted for as well.
Yep, that's critical, because as soon as you set it up, just based on a timing perspective, if you don't have that, the system will fail. No doubt.
Exactly.
Tying, so you've got your buckets depending on what your circumstances are, and it could be as simple as a holiday bucket with a point of sale and a non-point of sale bucket. What I tend to do with my own personal circumstances is the point of sale is attached to an FPOS card. Here we go, I'm tapping again. Basically, that's the one that I carry around with me in my wallet, whereas the non-point of sale one, I do have a card, but that card's kept at home. So there's no cross-contamination from that perspective. Regardless of what your budget structure, regardless of what your bank account structure looks like and your buckets look like, regardless of how many you've got, the crucial part here is making sure that you identify the right amount of money off your budget and then pushing that in. And the idea is to set this up automatically as well too, so you don't have to do this manually. It just happens as time progresses and as you get paid and whatever frequency that you've set it up on. But the idea is getting it back to the budget and figuring out how much money you need to put into what respective bucket that you've identified works for you and your circumstances is absolutely critical.
Yeah. The other thing that really works, and you have to have the discipline around it as well, but the other thing that works fantastically well is if you're someone who receives a bonus once a year or every 6 months, if you're someone who doesn't have the same regular income every month, you have the ability to set up all of your direct debits, all of your expenses based off just your normal weekly income, and anything that comes on top is just cream that effectively you can decide on what you do. Maybe, I've worked hard, I'm going to, of a $10,000 bonus, I'm going to put $2,000 extra towards, my holidays for the year, and the remainder I'm going to put towards saving or investment. But what it prevents you from doing, in essence, is your expenditure keeping in line with your income increasing. So all too common, you're earning 60 grand a year, and you're surviving perfectly fine, you're perfectly happy. All of a sudden your income increases to 80 grand a year. You're not putting any additional money towards savings or investments or anything like that. And all of a sudden you've got a lifestyle creep and your lifestyle's just increased and you haven't actually seen where it's gone. So this is really being able to identify and essentially have control over, okay, if I am going to increase my lifestyle, which 100% you should. I'm not saying that you should, live like a 21-year-old at uni eating 2-minute noodles all of the time. But if your lifestyle is increasing, that's a measured decision. It's something that you're deciding on rather than something that's just happening and all of a sudden you've got no money left over to show for it.
Yeah, and that's critical too. I mean, you don't want to increase your income, reaping the reward of the effort that you've put into your career or whatever it may be, and not reward yourself. But this is just a measured approach to be able to be balanced about it, because if you can tick as many of those boxes as possible, I think that's probably the best way to go about it. But that's a really good segue into how often we should review this and look at it, because it's not the structure may be static once you've got it right, but the percentages and the amount of money going into each bucket is going to change based on a whole range of factors. In that example that you used before, Andrew, somebody's income going up, or especially at the moment with the increasing cost of absolutely everything, you may need to tweak those percentages, which then even goes back to saying, okay, do it in an Excel format if you can, because it's easy enough to adjust. That's probably the thought process behind that. But yeah, in terms of looking at the budget and adjusting this, how often do you recommend that we should be looking at it?
Look, there's a few key things. Number one is at least annually. If you're not looking at it at least once a year, then it's going to run away from you. The numbers are not going to be accurate. The cost of things that you're purchasing, the amounts that you're distributing are not going to be relevant. So at the very least annually, but also when there's ever a significant change in terms of your circumstances, your income or your expenses. So if there's been an increase in terms of, for instance, if if you've got a significant mortgage and the RBA is increasing interest rates at 0.5% every month, you need to adjust for that in your budget. There should be, exactly right. If you've got nappies that you need to pay for that you never used to have to pay for before, make sure that you're accounting for it in your budget. But any time that there's a significant change, you should be adjusting for it. One of the things that I like to do with this strategy is you account for a buffer within it. So if your expenses, or if you look at your, whether it's your fixed expenses or your direct debit expenses or non-point of sale expenses, if that's going to be, I don't know, pick a number, $1,500 a month, you want to account for a buffer within it. You don't want to be, doing it so fine where if one expense is slightly more, it's going to throw everything out.
Yeah.
You want to account for whatever, $1,600 or $1,700, so that even if there are some slight changes, it's not going to completely throw everything out, and it just means that you don't have to look at it quite so frequently. But once everything's set up, it is so easy to manage, and it's so easy to keep an eye on your spending. It's so easy to see what your savings is. It's so easy to account for. Yeah, I can go on that holiday every year, as opposed to just, who knows? Let's just book it and see what happens.
Yep. No, absolutely. And I guess the other thing to note with this is it's not necessarily just about your cash flow and getting your banking structure right. There's obviously other parts to this: increasing your income, which we'll talk about in a sec, decreasing expenses. So you start to do, I guess, those three things in combination with one another. It does become quite powerful, and it's quite empowering when you do get that, and it gives you a sense of confidence around your money management, because for a lot of people that I talk to that go through this, it's the first time in a long time that they've actually felt in control of their financial position, because that's the thing that hurts. We might have a wealth creation or an investment strategy in play, but that's obviously longer term. But the day-to-day, where the rubber meets the road, is managing your money. And if that's not right, you just don't have that sense of confidence. But the amount of people that we've been speaking to and have put through this program in particular, absolutely empowering for everyone. So maybe we talk about those things now in terms of
So we'll run through a bit of a quick fire across things that you can do to really maximize the budget, maximize the cash flow. And first one, and sometimes this is possible, sometimes it's not possible, but if you can add additional sources of income in, that's only going to be for the better. Whether that's putting a bit of overtime at work, whether that's taking on a side hustle, a second job, or whatever it is that's going to add additional income in, that's only going to help support this. However, jumping back to what we were discussing and what Billy was saying at the start of this, a lot of the times, if there's a deficit in terms of cash flow, it's not actually a symptom of not having enough income, it's a symptom of overspending. So
most of the time.
So you can do all you want from an income perspective, but as long as you're making sure that you're examining the expenses, that's the key in all of this. But additional income is certainly something that can help out.
Yeah, just picking up on that point. So even if you expand or increase your income, fundamentally, if you've got a problem with this, regardless of how much, using that analogy right at the start, it's about how much you keep. Yeah. So if you don't have the basics and the fundamentals right, you could go and double your income and you'd still have the same issue on your hands.
Exactly right.
Yep.
And looking at things and incentives that can help boost this, even if it's short term and it's not necessarily long term. So one of the incentives at the moment, if I think it's Australia wide, isn't it? Mm-hmm. The power saving bonus. So $250 power saving bonus to basically, compare your power and energy suppliers. Take advantage of things like that, and if you can add some income into the household, then fantastic.
Yep. No, absolutely. One of the quick ones that I think is really easy to do because it stands out is assessing and analysing your direct debit expenses. So that's a real easy one because they're frequent and usually they're the same amount. So looking at those and figuring out, not only just figuring out, one, do you need them? Yep. So, as part of my usual process when I look at this, we had subscription services. I'm sure the kids just know the passwords and know the bank accounts and log in and stuff, but we had subscription services to all of them. So we trim those right back as an example, and they're only small amounts of money, but it just goes to show that it can get out of hand, and it was a really easy one to identify. So we got rid of a lot of those. But analysing your direct debit expenses, really in my thinking, it's to try and achieve two things. The first one is if you can eliminate them because you don't need them, fantastic. Like in my example, using the streaming services, there's only so much TV you want your children to watch, but you don't need Netflix and Stan, Disney and Prime and all the other ones. One is more than enough. So if you can eliminate. Yeah. The second one, and it kind of ties back to what you were saying with that energy rebate, is looking at what you're paying for and either picking up the phone and talking to that particular provider or shopping around and seeing if you can get a better deal somewhere else. And in all of my experience doing this, you can always get a better deal, either by talking to your current provider or someone else. People are always itching for, competition, and there's always deals and specials around. So the opportunity there is worth the effort of picking up the phone, doing the assessment, going through it, and pushing the prices of those ones down.
Yeah, and these are all, they're one percenters. Like if you can get a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, a little bit there, at the end of the day, it's gonna make it's gonna paint a far bigger, or far better picture at the end of the day. But yeah, absolutely. The other one is debt. Whether it's personal loans or credit cards or whatever it is, if you've got an opportunity to either consolidate those debts and being careful around making sure that you can pay off before the interest rate increases. But if you can consolidate those debts into a lower interest rate, if you can pay off the ones with a higher interest rate first and then knock off the ones with a lower interest rate, but getting a handle on paying off your debts is going to then free up cash flow once that eventually is expunged, and making sure that you put a stop to the credit cards, the afterpays, the buy now pay laters of the world, and make sure that you're not getting yourself into that position in the future.
Yep. One of the big ones with this too as well is, and it's been making its way around the media recently, is the loyalty tax. Yep. So this one in particular I think applies to mortgages, but it's sticking with the current lender that you've got. Just because you know them, you like their online banking environment, you can't be bothered going through the process, whatever it may be. But that seems to be one of the really big ones, and they call it a loyalty tax because they've done an assessment, and if you stick with that lender for longer than you should, you're actually paying for it in terms of the interest rate. So don't ask me why, because it doesn't work in any other business sense, but in my mind, it's always easier to keep a client and cheaper to keep an existing client than to attract a new one.
Yeah.
With the banks, it seems to be the other way around, that if you're new to the bank, they'll actually offer you, most of the time, something that's more competitive than an existing client that they've already got. So in this instance, one of the really big things that you can look at to try and get your expenses and your costs down is looking at your debt and seeing if there's something that you can do from that perspective.
Yeah. Have a chat to your mortgage broker. The big one is the mortgage, but all of the other debts on there as well are definitely within that. The other kind of, again, it's a psychological thing as opposed to an actual financial thing, but you can overdo it. There is such a thing as budget fatigue, so don't say that you're going to stay home every night and not go out and not do anything. You need to make sure that this is sustainable for the long term. Absolutely, if you can reduce your going out, and you should make a concerned effort to try and reduce your expenditure in terms of going out, and if you can meal prep as opposed to going out for lunches and things like that, fantastic. But make sure that this is sustainable in the long term, because you also don't want to get into a position whereby it's fantastic, you use it for a few months and then all of a sudden it's just too hard and you go back to the old ways.
Yeah, and from my perspective, when we build these things, take me for argument's sake, I enjoy coffee, so I know that it'd be unrealistic for me to put myself in a position where I say, okay, I'm not going to buy a cup of coffee a day.
Yeah.
Put it into your budget if that's your thing. You still need to live. You still need to be able to enjoy yourself. So if there's something that's for you that you enjoy doing, you might be a foodie and enjoy going out, put that in, make a provision for it in your budget, and don't stop doing it. Because if you stop doing the things that bring you joy, I sound like Marie Kondo now, but if you stop doing the things that bring you joy, you're going to be miserable.
Yeah.
And you don't want to do that. So you've just got to be realistic about it, budget for it, and keep doing those things. But once again, I think the best way that all of this works is if you keep it in some sort of moderation and some balance, and have a strategy and a structure and a plan associated with it. Yeah.
Last final point that I'm going to touch on is just, once you've got that surplus, make sure that you get it out. So if you've developed a surplus income, if you've developed a savings, if you've gotten a bonus, if you've developed something in that initial hub account that's not going to be diminished for another purpose, make sure that you put it into a separate savings account, make sure that you put it into an investment account, make sure that you do something with the money, because when money's there, it's really easy and tempting to spend, whereas when it's not there, a lot of the times it's out of mind, out of sight. So if you do, or not if you do, but once you develop this strategy and once you develop a surplus income, make sure that you've then got something off the back end of it to filter that money into, so that you're getting that out of reach, so to speak, and that you're actually capitalizing on the hard work that you're doing.
Yeah. From our perspective, it's beyond the scope of today's discussion, but you capture your surplus, you maximize your surplus. The next part of the equation is, what do you then do with it, which ties into what you were talking about. So from a wealth creation perspective, maximizing and capturing the surplus is the first part, which is what we had spoken about today, using some strategies. Second part, deploy it and do something with it.
Yeah, exactly. Bills, thank you. Another great podcast, and I think we've summarized that very well. One of the things that I'll also put out there as well is we've got a tailored cash flow education plan where we step clients through it. It's a 3-step process, and we run through this strategy with them on a one-to-one basis as well. So if you are struggling with it, or you do feel that you need any further help, please reach out to either Billy or myself. It's definitely something that we've seen work time and time again.
Yeah, we're finding that it's such a big, and the reason why we developed this is because it's such a big area that has so much of an impact. And not that people get wrong, but going through this process is, we enjoy it because it's obviously what we do for a living, but not a lot of people can feel like they can do it successfully on their own, and created this program to try and get more people to feel more comfort and more secure around their cash flow. So definitely, if you fall into that category, if you want some more information, feel free to reach out. We'd be more than happy to have a chat around that. But Andrew, as always, thank you. Really appreciate it.
And thanks again to our listeners and viewers for tuning in to another episode.
We'll catch you on the next one. Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we've talked about, or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature, and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amiridis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Pty Ltd, authorized representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.